So I already described kind of some of my motivations in transitioning from a research scientist to business development. I really loved working in technology BD and learned an immense amount there, as we discussed. But ultimately, I became a bit frustrated with the lack of risk appetite in pharma. Early stage deals on truly new and innovative technologies can be the most challenging partnerships to execute because the science is not yet proven. And even if the economics are reasonable, which is often not the case, there's still an opportunity cost for the pharma who must pick and choose where to spend their resources. I was lucky enough to have an office next to Janice Nave, who leads Amgen Ventures. And over time, found myself knocking on her door more and more to come say, hey, Janice, I found this cool technology. It's too early to partner on it, but instead, could we perhaps invest in it with the selfish goal of building relationships with this company that could maybe grow into a BD partnership down the road? And it was really through this work with Amgen Ventures that the idea of pursuing a career in venture capital first piqued my interest. I'll also take this opportunity to publicly thank Chaz, who actually introduced me to the a16z team, for which I will be forever grateful. So thank you. But regarding the trend more generally, I think for the right type of person, the transition from BD to VC is a really natural one. You're comfortable with quickly picking up new areas of science. You know how to diligence a company and its science well. You understand how pharma thinks. So ultimately, you know whether or not this will actually be interesting to the downstream buyer. One of the big differences, particularly for early stage VC, is that the level of risk tolerance is different. And there's also the fact that at the end of the day, you as the VC must make the investment decision rather than leaning on a diligence team that you are guiding and working closely with.
I have the contrarian view on the question, actually, Chaz, which is it's not clear to me that that trend truly exists in a sense of a shift of percentages of people moving from one job to another. I think a large part of what's happened in the industry since March of 2020 and most acutely in the last year is just an enormous amount of turnover in positions. And, I think it was in September, just overall in the economy, 3.4% job turnover rate, job quits rate at least, which equates to something like 40% turnover per year in the US writ large, which is just an enormous number relative to historical standards. So I'm not actually sure I agree with the premise of the question that we've seen a growing trend. I can certainly speak to, my reasons for leaving, which I'm happy to. I would say the biggest reason I left was the amount of science that can be done at an early stage startup as a percentage of the activity occurring at the startup is much higher. Certainly, Amgen and the other farmers do lots of early stage science, but a very large percentage of their time and activities is spent on essentially a single experiment, right? You run a phase 3 trial, you run a phase 2 trial. It's one experiment. It's a very important, very expensive experiment that requires lots of resources, lots of attention, lots of very smart people to make it effective and successful. But at the end of the day, it's basically one experiment. And at early stage companies and at early stage research in general, you have the ability to do lots of different experiments, lots of pivots, lots of changes, and a lot of flexibility that later stage clinical trials just simply can't do as a matter of the cost and time to move that kind of ship. It's a very large aircraft carrier to move. And at large companies, because of the expense of trials, because of the expense of moving that aircraft carrier group from opportunity to opportunity, they've quite understandably set up committees and strategic priorities so that things are consistent year to year. If you're running a 5-year clinical trial in cardiovascular space, for example, you want to continue to invest in cardiovascular in ways that are consistent with the trial you're running, which may or may not be the optimal thing in terms of what the latest novel targets are in neuro, right, for example, or in COVID, right? It makes it a little bit more difficult to turn that very large aircraft carrier group, as an analogy, at the drop of a dime. And so that's what excited me about VC, is that there's lots of new experiments run day to day in all of the portfolio companies, lots of new experiments to look at from the perspective of what's out there in the world and the landscape writ large. And the ability to pivot and move quickly from trend to trend is quite easy, quite quick, and quite nimble. And in fact, in a way, we're incentivized. That's one of the biggest differences, in fact, moving from a larger organization to a small VC, is the decision-making process is much, much faster, and the ability to change decisions on the ground based off of the latest data and evidence is just much, much faster and much, much simpler.